Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Nadia Lali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East Studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, which is part of a lecture series on queering the Middle East and its diasporas. The lecture series is supported by the Herbert H. Goldberger Lectureship Fund and co-sponsored by the LGBTQIA and Plus Thinking Initiative, as well as the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. And today I'm happy to welcome Sima Shakhsari. Professor Sima Shakhsari is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Sima. They are interested in transnational feminist theory, transnational sexuality studies, non-Eurocentric queer and transgender studies, Middle East studies, empire, militarism, neoliberal governmentality, biopolitics, digital media, refugees, diasporas, and political anthropology. Aside from their academic work, Dr. Shakhsari has a long history of activism at queer and women's organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area. Their book, Politics of Rightful Killing, which I just have here and read recently, and it's really brilliant. So that's Politics of Rightful Killing, Civil Society, Gender and Sexuality in Weblogistan, was published by Duke University Press in 2020. And the book provides an analysis of Weblogistan as a site of cyber governmentality, where simultaneously national and neoliberal gendered subjectivities are produced through online and offline heteronormative disciplining and normalizing techniques, and where the concept of loaned life is subjected to a pending death in the name of rights. Now, Dr. Shakhsari is currently working on their second book, manuscript tentatively titled Moving Queers and Queer Moves, Deterritorialization and Loaned Life. The project combines ethnographic research among Iranian queer and transgender refugees and refugee rights organizations with the analysis of queer diasporic literature, films, theater, and activist organizations to extend the concept of loaned life. So I hope we might get to this, Sima. Now, just before I'm going to start the conversation with you, I'd like to just say something about the structure of today's event. Sima and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. If you have a question or comment, please put that in the Q&A function and I'll monitor that. So Sima, welcome. Really wonderful to have you with us today. Now, before asking you more specific questions about your book, The Politics of Rightful Killing, and also recently in an article that you're working on, or ideas that you're sort of working on, which I think with this working title of Queer States, Geopolitics and Queer Anthropology, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your research trajectory. So what have you been working on and how did you get interested in the kinds of work that you do?
Thank you so much, Nadia, for having me and for reading the book and introducing the book. I really appreciate that. And many thanks to Barbara and Alex for all the behind the scenes work that you have been doing. Yes, as you said, the title of this talk is Queer States, and that is something that I just recently wrote and, have been basically trying to think about. And I wrote it because I was asked to write a chapter for the book that Margot Weiss is editing called Queer Anthropology. So it was, the intention was to write about queer anthropology of the state. So I thought, since this is something that I have been thinking about and writing about recently, I could talk about that. But of course, we can also talk about the book because they're quite related to each other. In terms of my research trajectory, for decades, I've been interested in the politics of the Iranian diaspora and in relationship to gender and sexuality. And, whether it's my activist work or academic work, I've been very much, thinking about how gender and sexuality are articulated in Iranian diasporic formations and the kinds of politics towards the so-called homeland. So I, when I was a grad student, of course, I worked on or intended to actually think about queerness among Iranian diaspora and started blogging. And that was, in the early 2000s when soon after, the September 11, 2001, Persian blogging became a thing. There were more than 100,000 Persian blogs. And there was this hype about blogging, setting Iranians free, and so on and so forth. So I was actually, shifting my research from thinking about the satellite television programs that were produced in Los Angeles and broadcast to Iran to the world of Persian blogging, because there were a lot of, like I said, there was a hype and a lot of news reports about Persian blogging. And from there, as I was doing my research and focusing on gender and sexuality, I saw that it's, quite related to the politics of democratization when it comes to the participation of the Iranian diaspora in the freedom projects. So it became really kind of a political anthropology kind of research, and I continued that thread and wrote about the US democratization project, which is something that I talk about in the book, and we can talk about that later. So, and of course, towards the end of my dissertation, there was an incident that made me kind of think about the project that I'm working on now and have been writing about actually for almost a decade now. And that is Iranian queer refugees. When I was in Toronto, where I was doing part of my field work, an Iranian trans woman committed suicide. And to me, it really affected me in a way that her story, which had become so publicized in all these films about trans Iranians and their suffering, no one talked about her death in Toronto, as if it didn't fit that story of fleeing the home of oppression, i.e. Iran, to coming to the so-called free world, Canada. So that is how I became interested in the politics of death, queer and trans death. And so I have done field work in Turkey among Iranian queer and trans refugee applicants in Turkey, and how their lives become disposable in the name of protection of their rights or in the name of refugee rights. So that's kind of the trajectory. And of course, thinking about both of these projects, whether it was Weblogus on the Iranian blogosphere or queer and trans refugees, often there is this kind of obsession with the state. State becomes the sole force, or the entity that the assumption is that state is or state has monopoly over violence. And I've been thinking beyond that, thinking about the art of government in civil society, and that is through NGOs, through the human rights regimes, refugee regimes, the so-called liberating states, and Iranian diaspora who participate in the kind of normalization of the Iranian population at large. So that is, I don't know if that responds to your question, but that's kind of the trajectory.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, of course, you do, very different work from kind of research that I've been involved with. But what sort of resonates a lot is that, I mean, I can imagine, just as I was not able, working on Iraq, to not pay attention to the, political developments. I mean, sanctions, war, conflict, occupation. And I can only imagine that, of course, these issues have influence. And I mean, you're writing about it as well in your book. I mean, there is 9/11, but then there are all the sort of Iran specific issues, both in the context of what's happening within Iran, but also US Iranian relations. So maybe we can come back to some of these issues later on. I'm just sort of thinking, because as I mentioned initially, and so this event is part of a lecture series on queering the Middle East. And one of the issues that I've been trying to sort of address with all my guests is this idea of what queer studies actually means in the context of Middle East studies. Because I mean, I think I'm not an expert, but from what I understand, and I'm sort of trying to this year teach a course on queering migration and diasporas. Well, actually, it's gendering migration diasporas, but a queer lens is an important aspect. But what I find is that, much of the literature in terms of queer theory and even queer of color critique tends to be quite US centric. So, I guess I'm sort of interested to know from you, what does a queer anthropology entail in your view? And how can we queer Middle East studies? And how can we decenter the US in terms of queer studies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think this is something that several people now have been working on and writing about. Shirin Seikali and some other people did special issue on queering Middle East, and then a GLQ, again, Lesbian Quarterly issue that was edited by Anjali Arondekar and Geeta Patel, focused on geopolitics. And part of that was to think about how queer theory has very much become the turf of the US kind of theorization, right? So when you think about queer theory, people often in these annual meetings go to American studies. So American studies has become the home for queer theory. And the reason for that is, of course, the disciplinary divide and the way that Middle East studies or area studies in general, in the eye of queer theory, are seen as kind of very much bound to the nation state, identity bound, and therefore not queer or not queer enough. So whatever that comes from Middle East studies or from the elsewhere is not considered to be queer theory, as Geeta Patel and Anjali Arondekar argue, and Jaspir Kaur and Maya Makdoshi also have an article in that issue where they talk about this, that queer theory, despite its claims to move beyond the fixed notions of sexual identity, still very much centers sexuality in the way that recenters the kind of formations in the U.S., the human sexuality form in the U.S., and then kind of assumes that the rest of the world has to match those definitions and those ways of thinking about life, death, sexuality, and so on and so forth. So you're right, I think, in saying that much of the queer theory, even queer of color theory, very much focuses on the US. And of course, queer of color theory is thinking about racial formations and the exclusions of queer theory in the US context, and the way that sexuality has been the kind of the focal point in the racial exclusions. And there is, that is, of course, very important. And that seminal work, of course, needs to be taught in the classrooms, not just in the US, but elsewhere. But when we think about queering Middle East or queering Middle East studies, I think the assumption is that Middle East is not queer, and therefore we have to queer it, or excavate some kind of queerness in our past history, or this and that. And I think rather than that, we can think about queerness otherwise, and the way that in queer states, for example, I've been thinking about that or talking about that has been through this kind of lens of not thinking of queerness as necessarily attached to sexual injury or sexual identities. And that is, Kathy Cohen, of course, thinking about queer of color critique in the 90s, said that queer theory, despite its claims of moving beyond fixed notions of sexual identity, by focusing on particular forms of queerness, is recentering sexual identities. And rather than that, Kathy Cohen suggested that we can think about shared struggles. So, when she's talking about the welfare queen and, bulldagger, and thinking about how it is these forms of exclusion that, of course, have to do with sexuality, but are not necessarily about queer as an identity, would be a way to think about queer theory. And then, if we think about that in the context of the Middle East, some people have been doing that work. Hassan Mousavi's recent book, or, Jasper Poir and many other people who have been thinking about queerness beyond the kind of Euro-American epistemological traditions, and thinking about forms of exclusion. And, that is how I'm thinking about queerness in the Middle East, not as necessarily sexual identities that have histories in the US, and trying to kind of use the US as a yardstick against which other places are measured, but as thinking otherwise. And I have to mention here, I wrote an article that came out in Arab Studies Journal a year ago or so, and that is thinking about queerness through Fatemeh Mernissy's dreams of trespass. I mean, if you think about Fatemeh Mernissi, she's not considered to be queer, or actually some people think of her as homophobic, right? So I'm using her text to think about other ways of thinking about queerness through alliances through time, as she talks about, alliances between women through telling stories. And that is one way of thinking about undoing the Euro-American epistemological traditions, because we don't need to come up with or follow the queer canon in the US. We can think about scholars, in particular feminist scholars, who have been writing in ways that may not be considered to be queer, but actually give us ways of thinking about queerness otherwise. And that is what I try to do.
Yeah, thanks. And I actually sort of just directly following up. So in your work, you do make a case. I mean, your recent work, you make a case for a queer approach to geopolitics and the state specifically. And you're asking the question whether failed states might be queer states. And so I was wondering if you could explain what you mean by that, and how does that concretely translate in your work?
Sure. Yeah, so, this is, again, going back to the notion of queer state that I said, the article that I worked on. And again, thinking about queerness, often people, when they think about queer states, what comes to mind is states that have rights for queers, meaning rights for LGBTQAI, the list of identities that continues, of course, in the context of the states. Often it is gays and lesbians and trans people who are given certain rights, the right to join the military, the right to get married. And of course, within queer theory in the US, there have been some excellent critiques of that, critiques of homonormativity, Lisa Dugan's work long time ago, but also more recent work on what does it mean to actually be complicit with forms of power, with US military apparatus, what does it mean when gay marriage actually ends up normalizing queers? What does it mean when it kind of privatizes healthcare and social services that should be actually universal, but rather than, through marriage, they become privatized? So, but the way that I'm thinking about queer states is not necessarily, and of course there's also critique of state as straight. You have Margot Canada's book Straight State, I don't know, Edna Lupid and other people who have written about how the US state in particular is very much invested in heteronormativity. But the way I'm using queer states is actually thinking, as you said, through the notion of failed states. Because when people in political science, political theory think about failed states, they talk about states that fail to provide services for their citizens, or violate the human rights of their citizens, or kind of fail to join the international community in a sense. And I'm thinking about those within the context of geopolitics, that why is that, for example, because my work is on Iran, how is it that sanctions actually is completely erased in thinking about why is that the Iranian state cannot provide certain services, right? What the restrictions that are put on Iran that don't necessarily affect, as you have written in your work, Nadia, don't affect necessarily the elites or the state, but they actually kill people, right? They kill ordinary people, in particular, the most marginalized people, including queer and trans people, working class queer and trans people, I should say. So I'm thinking about if we think about failure as a queer art, as Jack Halberstam has written, then why not think about failed states as queer states in a way that they're excluded from the so-called family of nations, right? So, and are subjected to disciplinary measures such as sanctions or war, as it was in the case of Iraq. And that doesn't mean that those states, again, I'm not thinking through the lens of sexual identities. That doesn't mean that when I say queer states that they're queer friendly, but I'm thinking about queering as the way that the forms of exclusion that make populations killable, constitutes queerness. So when I talk about queer states, I'm thinking about how queerness produces states, particular states, and how states produce particular forms of queerness that are then normalized. So that article kind of tries to rethink the idea of states. And this is not, again, it's not to give value to queer and say queer is good, straight is bad, right? So it's not to set up queer and straight as these binaries, but think about queerness as through the lens that people, like Jessica Poir in her work on homo nationalism has done, to think about forms of, how certain populations become available for death and injury and are queered racially, as Poir would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I find this really, very interesting, and sort of it links up, as you say, to some of the ideas that developed by Jasbir Puar, Maya Mekdashi, and also when Hassan Moussaoui speaks about, conflict and war becoming kind of the norm. I mean, he's also speaking about a failed state, but you really look at it specifically in relation to Iran. I guess, just sort of listening and thinking about it, I'm sort of wondering, but where the sort of the queerness or the queering, is that then unidirectional? Is that the queering happening from the vantage point of the US or other, the Western context? Or is it a kind of more transnational queering? Where lies the agency here? I'm just sort of trying to think it through as I'm listening to you.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think, it's a matter of the US queering, say, Iran or whatnot. I think it's the question of again, process and geopolitics. How is that in hegemonic forms of thinking about notions such as international community, right, human rights, violation of human rights, then how already sort of value is put, and it becomes a consensus in the kind of international community, in a sense that who is the violator of human rights and who is the protector of human rights, right? So it's kind of not necessarily, and of course, you know, the Iranian state, as I say in my in the article that I also sent you, it's not to exonerate the Iranian state of its policies against queer people, or, you know, is basically interest in the biopolitical normalization of population. But it is to think about how within the context, again, thinking about geopolitics and the unequal power. I mean, when we talk about states or international community or the United Nations, the assumption often is that states have the same kind of power and they're on the same kind of level of power relationships, and they can have negotiations, sit at a table. That's not the case. You know, we are, and moving beyond Iran, you know, we can think about colonial legacies, think about foreign aid, you know, how foreign aid in Africa has become contingent on the records of LGBTQ rights, right? How Clinton said gay rights are human rights, and used that as a way to basically consider certain nation states as those who are violators, and therefore kind of excluding them from foreign aid and so on and so forth. So these are, and of course, as you know, Raoul Rao, for example, writes in the case of Uganda, these policies are not helping queers in those locations. On the contrary, they open, and because of these economic policies, you know, they open room for all these, you know, Christian organizations and NGOs to basically come in, provide services, and actually reproduce heteronormativity and homophobia in ways that are hurting queers in those locations. So it's not a matter, I mean, you know, again, if you are thinking about agency is not outside of power, right? So it is really, I think my point is to think about complicities and to think about the way that queerness has become one of the measures, or one of the kind of the criteria through which states are categorized from autocratic or theocratic to liberal democratic. So it is kind of to undo that normalization and giving value to liberal democracy is the ideal forms of governance, as opposed to, say, you know, theocracy, and even using those terms, you know, to think about states. So
yeah, thanks for that clarification, Sima. So going specifically now to your book, The Politics of Rightful Killing, Civil Society, Gender and Sexuality in Weblogistan. In the book, you convincingly argue that the Iranian and also the Iranian diaspora's cyberspace is a manifestation of transnational civil society. And this is a space, you say, that is not only challenging state power and authoritarianism, but crucially also a site of governmentality and normalization. And can you start out by explaining what the term Weblogistan actually entails, and reflect on the main arguments in your book that, to my mind, you know, challenge prevailing ideas about both cyberspace and civil society?
So Weblogistan, basically, you know, like it's done in many other states, is kind of, it has a territorial connotation, right? The land of. So Weblogistan is the land of weblogs or blogs. And it was a term that no one knows who coined, but it was used by bloggers, Iranian bloggers, Weblogistan, to think about, the community of bloggers. And when I talk about Weblogistan as a site of civil society, it is to point to the fact that, yes, a lot of dialogue was happening, in particular in the height of blogging among Iranians in mid-2000s, among a particular group of Iranians in Iran and outside of Iran. Because of this conversation, it was kind of a transnational site of civil society. And often and in many of these glorifying kind of accounts of webloggers, I'm sorry, my cats are going crazy running around here. And many of these accounts, you hear or you would see that Weblogistan is the site of civil society. The assumption was that it is where civil society flourishes in Iran for the first time. So in a sense, it kind of suffered, this account suffered from historical amnesia. It totally erased the long history of civil society in post-revolutionary Iran, in particular after 1989, the end of the Iran-Iraq war in 88, the death of Ayatollah Khomeini and many other changes. So a part of the book argues that no, it's not the site of civil society. It is exactly because of the pre-existing conversations and all the social movements and all these the organizing that has been happening that are not also separate from the state. I talk about state not as this kind of monolithic top-down structure, but as very much, fractured, and also having, those fractures enabling the possibility of reform in Iran. So I talk about the reform movement in Iran and how the emergence of Weblogistan is not separate from a pre-existing civil society, but also part of the way that people think about, and part of the question of civil society is that rather than thinking about civil society as a site of consensus in the Habermasian way, thinking about it as a site of conflict, where actually, as I discuss in the book, very violent conflicts happening with Weblogistan and in the discussions that happen, and the gendered and racial and ethnic exclusions through nationalist discourses that are repeated in Weblogistan. So part of it is to say that, well, yes, it is a transnational site of civil society. And exactly because of that is a part of, it's a site of conflict and violence. And then rather than thinking about civil society in a top-down relationship to the state, where often people think here's the state, here's civil society, and then you have, the citizens, rather than thinking about it as kind of an antagonistic or top-down relationship with the state, where state kind of has all the power to discipline its citizen, I think about civil society in a Foucauldian sense as a site of governmentality. That is, state is not, or doesn't have monopoly over governance, but, thinking about governmentality as this assemblage or nexus of individuals, discourses, institutions, that of course, through biopower, as Foucault would say, focus on the individual, but aim to normalize the population at large. So I think about how civil society then becomes, and Weblogistan as a site of civil society becomes a site where particular forms of Iranian subjectivities are normalized in this kind of intersection of nationalist discourses and this kind of so-called liberating discourses of the US or some European states that are interested in democratization of Iran. So that is how kind of notions of geopolitics and biopolitics come together. And then I also talk about how, despite the insistence of the US on providing internet freedom to Iran, at the same time the deadliest sanctions are imposed on the Iranian people. So that is where necropolitics also comes into this kind of analysis, to think about how the Iranian population becomes governable or managed, and at the same time becomes disposable and subjected to a pending death through sanctions.
Yeah, I want to get back to that issue. Just as a reminder, so if you would like to put in your question or comments, please do that in the Q&A function. So as I was listening to you, I was actually, the one time I did manage to go to Iran. I mean, I hope that I will be able to go again at some point in the future, but I was invited in 2005 at the height of the Khatami area. I was invited to speak at an event on civil society. And they had invited, it was actually interestingly sort of co-sponsored by the Ministry of Interior and civil society organizations. And they had invited people from all over the place, from Pakistan, from Russia, to speak about civil society organizations. And I was speaking about civil society organizations in Egypt, feminist civil society organizations. But what really struck me, what I found really amazing, and particularly in comparison to the kinds of experiences I had while living in Egypt, was the kind of confidence of some of the young, especially women. So there was one panel where evidently someone from the Ministry of Interior was supposed to chair the panel. And a young woman stood up and said, this is a conference on civil society. Why are you chairing this panel? And this was sort of simultaneous translation. And, I was so shocked to then hear the guy say, okay, fine, I go down and you come up here. And I found that really mind-boggling. But I mean, it also tells you, of course, something about the, as you say, the kind of relationship between civil society and governmentality, which is not only more blurred in the context of the Middle East, but actually transnationally as well. One of the things I really enjoyed, many things that I enjoyed the book, is when you sort of go and focus on the bloggers, and you provide these really interesting accounts and sort of an in-depth really lens into the various discourses and narratives and reactions. It becomes clear that they're not homogeneous. Clearly they're sort of very different. And in one area that becomes obvious is also sort of the area of sexuality, how people deal with sexuality, and you show how Islamic sexuality often tends to be conflated with tradition, but at the same time we know it's also equated with hypersexuality, as you also argue. And then at the same time, we know that modern and civilized is frequently being associated with heteronormativity and more recently homonormativity. So it's very complex. But it's not only in the international media that there is this hyper visibility of the Iranian queer, but one of the many tensions and contradictions you highlight revolves around the way that bloggers actually tended to shift their narratives and discourses around gender and sexuality in the context of growing homonationalism during the war on terror. So what was happening there? Can you sort of explain to us what was going on?
Sure. To make it really quick, we might be running out of time, so that there's time for Q&A. This is where, actually you were one of the first, maybe the first person who invited me to talk about the entrepreneurship, neoliberal entrepreneurship. I remember in Feminist Review, when that article that I wrote from a chapter of the, at that point, dissertation appeared. And so basically what was happening was that at that time, exactly because of the geopolitical interests of the US, there was a lot of funding for kind of, investment in propaganda and, democratization projects, and internet was an apt site to do that. So a lot of not all bloggers, of course, some of the bloggers who were very much interested in kind of making a living. In particular, these are bloggers outside of Iran, in Europe or North America, meaning Canada and the US, of course, were tapping into these opportunities. And of course, like I said before, because, being LGBT friendly has become the yardstick of progress and civilization and, democracy. People who were perhaps very homophobic, and I discussed some of these accounts, or very much invested in the heteronormative nation, all of a sudden became advocates of gay and lesbian rights, of course, of a sanitized type, right? So it was very interesting to see how these discussions emerged and how there was this kind of all of a sudden interest. Everyone and their brothers had become, a gay rights advocate and queer friendly. So that those discussions were really a part of what was happening, again, in the context of the so-called war on terror and democratization projects in Iran, and how queerness became a kind of a chic subject to talk about. But as I discuss in the book, it is a particular kind of as bloggers call it, homosexuality, that was tolerated. So it was discourses of tolerance, neoliberal discourses of tolerance that were deployed to say, if you're thinking about the future of Iran, and of course, we were practicing democracy in Weblog, a Song for a Democratic Future. If we are practicing democracy, then we should tolerate homosexuals. But of course, these were very much normal, the kind of homonormative notions of sexuality, where it would be a particular kind of, those who are normal, they get married, they're good citizens, and so on and so forth. So that is really what was happening. It was kind of in the context of neoliberal entrepreneurship. I discussed that these particular bloggers became very much interested in these discussions around queerness.
Yeah. I'm going to now turn to a question from Maris Kelada. Hello, Maris. So Maris is saying, thank you for this very engaging conversation. I would like you to elaborate more on how you conceive of subjectivity in relation to geopolitics and queerness. How do you set up an analysis that does not frame subjectivity as a passive outcome of these meta powers, be it the state or identity?
Well, thank you for that question. So I think about subjectivity in a sense through this lens of particular subject positions that become available. And then, of course, this is not a passive process, because as I discuss in the book, particular, bloggers knowingly tap into these opportunities. So it's not about the question of passivity. It's about how one becomes a subject. And that project, of course, is not outside of power. So when we are thinking about agency, and I assume you're pointing more towards the question of agency when you talk about passivity, that it is the when we are thinking about in a post-structuralist way, of course, thinking about notions of agency. Agency is not coming outside of power, but it is also enabled by dominant forms of power, but it's not necessarily, subverting them. It is, of course, shifting those dominant or hegemonic forms of power while being complicit. So my point here is to actually highlight complicities as well as forms of dissent. So it's neither to say that bloggers are passive victims of geopolitical interests of the US, nor to say that they're dissidents. It is to think about how, yes, there are forms of dissent that happen in a site like Weblogistan, so when I say site, not in the terms of website, but as kind of where these conversations happen. So it's both a site of dissent, both perhaps to the Iranian state and to global capitalism, but also a site of complicity. And I write about how some bloggers, the dominant forms of thinking about Weblogistan only highlight the dissent to the Iranian state, not paying attention to the fact that actually the Iranian state also used blogs, right? So, and also there were bloggers who were very much loyal to the Iranian state, for example. So rather than kind of this binary of agency and passivity, I think my point is to think about how power works in very complex ways and how bloggers are not just agents of democratization or passive victims of global capitalism, but they basically participate in reproducing also these kind of hegemonic discourses, whether it's nationalism or liberation discourses of the US.
Mm. Yeah, so sort of following up on that, Sima, I've been thinking a lot about parallels and also differences in terms of Iran and Iraq, not only in terms of the impact of the war on terror, but also the very complex political positionings vis-a-vis US imperialist policies and authoritarian government. I was always struck how polarized some of these debates are, and have been. And they were also in the Iraqi diaspora, but somehow I feel they're even more polarized in the Iranian diaspora. Now, how has this tension been playing out in the context of the ongoing sanctions and the threat of war? And how has that changed as well? Because to my mind, what I see is that in the earlier years, and I was sometimes invited to speak at events organized by Iranian women, and they were sort of interested precisely in the parallels with the Iraqi situation, where you had sanctions, where you had an authoritarian government, where they had the threat of war. And while I found that sort of initially it was sort of extremely polarized, but now there are more these positions that you're describing where people are not refusing to be either this or that and have sort of more sort of, I guess, complex positions, but they're also, I guess, contextuals that you're sometimes pushed in certain situations to, stress one or the other. And I'm sort of wondering how in your mind this has been playing out and how you have been possibly shifting or not at all.
You're absolutely right. There are so many lessons to be learned from Iraq, and this is unfortunate to say because Iraq has paid a really hefty price for this, right? With millions dead and basically the situation that we are facing, that people of Iraq are facing. And I think, one can argue that even though the two are not the same, and people often say Iran is not Iraq, but there are so many similarities that one can see. The strategies, how the sanctions basically over time pushed Iraqi people to the point of basically not being able to even live, right? So I say that in something that I recently wrote from my own niece, who's a doctor, who basically during the sanctions with the COVID situation says, she was someone who was adamantly against US intervention. And she says, whatever we are already dying, so it doesn't matter even if the US attacks, right? So this is something that exactly the sanctions do, and that is the point of the sanctions, to increase discontent to the point, and to, of course, um, uh, intensify the authoritarianism of the state, to the point that people basically, it doesn't matter if it's bombs, or if it's basically dying from hunger, or lack of access to clean water or clean air or medicine. So there are, I think, many similarities. And Zainab Saleh's recent book, Return to Ruin, is discussing also that, and also the politics of diaspora, which, as you can, if you have read the book, there are a lot of similarities also with this kind of contentious politics of the diaspora. And if Iraq had Chalabis, Iran has many similar figures in the US that are very willing to participate in a kind of a military attack and regime change, and they're supporting the sanctions, and some of them claim to be feminists or representative of Iranian feminists, such as Masih Alinejad, right? And having kind of very close relationships with Trump and Pompeo under Trump administration. So these kinds of politics, the way that they, I think, play out, is this kind of polarization where people become, there's this form of situation where even activists in Iran who were before very much against the sanctions and were producing videos, feminist activists, I'm sure you have seen those videos of talking about why they're against wars, against the war in Iran. They're hesitant of doing that because the situation is so dire at this point in Iran. And I think the way that I have tried to participate in these kinds of, politics, in a sense, diasporic politics, is help co-found the coalition No Sanctions on Iran, and have different scholars and people talk about why sanctions hurt ordinary people and not the state, and how they hurt trans people, how they hurt queer people, how they hurt Iranian women's movement, and so on and so forth. So I'm going a little bit in tangents, but I just wanted to.
Yeah. No, it's an important point. So I'm going back to audience questions, and my colleague, Adi Ophir. Hello, Adi. Saying, thank you for a fascinating talk. You related very interestingly weak state and state's failure with the possible queerness of and the state. Given the recent failure of the US federal administration to declare an emergency when a catastrophic epidemic is taking place and to monopolize the use of violence, would it be useful or accurate to queer the US? And sorry for my US-centric question.
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you for your question. And yes, there is definitely the failure of the US, but this is, the US in terms of its failures is not new. It's not just the epidemic, with Katrina, with many incidents where the US actually has failed to protect, in particular, its racialized citizens, right? So it's nothing new. But then when it comes to, I'm talking about the kind of the way that the notion of failed state is deployed, right? Or weak state. We never think about the US as a weak state or a failed state. We never think about the state as a violator of human rights or queer and trans rights, whereas, there are so many queer and trans, in particular, queer and trans people of color who are being killed. The definition of basically refugee, when you think about the refugee regimes, one of the definitions is when the state fails to protect its citizens against violence. And the US certainly has historically failed not only to protect, but also subjected racialized populations to violence. But then when it comes to refugee regimes, we never, I mean, it's very unlikely that the UNHCR would accept or grant refugee status to a trans woman of color from the US, as I have argued this before. So when I say failed state or weak state is not, I mean, it's not to take those terminologies as the truth, but is to kind of question their deployment in the way that in the designation of states into those that are, again, liberal democratic and those that are weak states, authoritarian, theocratic, and so on and so forth. So there is definitely room to, I mean, there should be a questioning of those terms in the first place, right? But what I'm trying to convey here is the way that we these terms are deployed, not to take them as face value.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I would like to ask one last question. I mean, you've addressed it already in some ways, but maybe if more explicitly also in light of your forthcoming work, if you can sort of provide us with some working definition of this idea of loaned life, and I guess also link that to the title of your book, the published book, The Politics of Rightful Killing.
Sure. Thank you. And I'll try to make it quick for people who have to leave. So, Politics of Rightful Killing really is pointing to a form of politics, and I draw from the work that is done in the realm of biopolitics, borrowing from Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which is to make, live, and let die, right? So we're, and of course, Foucault is thinking in the context of Europe and the US, and not, quite concerned with the rest of the world. So we are thinking about populations whose lives are worth protecting and cultivating. So biopolitics is about cultivating life, right? A good life. And then on the other side, you have people who have kind of complicated Foucault's notion of biopolitics. Shil Mbembe, for example, or Agamben in different ways, thinking about, in Mbembe's words, necropolitics, basically populations that are made killable, right, or are let to die. And the examples that Mbembe brings are, for example, slaves in plantations, or Palestinians, or Agamben's example of Musalmans in the Nazi camps. So what I'm saying is that, well, even though biopolitics, of course, when Foucault writes about biopolitics, he does say that the cultivation of the life of one is at the expense of the diminishment of the other. And that for him is the definition of racism. And then we have populations who are in Agamben's words are reduced to bare life. Basically, they're stripped of rights, right? So there is where kind of Mbembe defines necropolitics. And what I'm saying is that, well, it isn't always this kind of binary that you have populations such as people of Iraq, such as people of Iran, who become apt for democratization, right? So they're subjected to kind of biopolitical practices. And the context of what I discuss in Iran is, how the defense of the Iranian people's lives becomes the obsession of many US politicians, that the Iranian people's heritage and so on and so forth are kind of invoked to say that the Iranian people, are those who can live a democratic life. So they kind of are seen as apt for democratization, but at the same time, they're subjected to a pending death through sanctions. So it's kind of a form of, not perhaps slow death, as Lauren Berland would say, but a soft form of killing, right? So it's kind of killing softly, as I say, through sanctions. And that is where I talk about politics of rightful killing. It's the kind of politics that sanctions death in the name of rights. So it's not stripping one of rights, but imbuing a population with rights, but exactly because of the so-called protection of those rights, making that populations killable. And the notion of loaned life then comes in this context where rather than bare life, being stripped of life, I argue that Iranian people live a loaned life, that their life becomes kind of like alone. And then, I need to think about this even more in the context of global capitalism and finance and all that. But just in the context of how Iranians, are given this life, right? That can be taken away at any time if, they don't basically, exactly because they carry a risk. The risk of terrorism that kind of is attached to their bodies as Iranians who are perceived as being terrorists. So this kind of sanctions on the Iranian people are creating this condition when the life of Iranian people, and that could be taken away through sanctions, or kind of in the shock and awe way.
I'm really sorry, Sima. I mean, I could continue this super fascinating and important conversation for a long time, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thanks so much for joining us, Sima. Thank you, the audience, for joining us. We have recorded this event, so we'll make it available. And hope to see you the next semester when we continue this series. Thank you, Sima.